Hello everyone. In this session, we will learn about network. MSW is essentially a network-supported game. Most of the games are multiplayer supported. To create games with this kind of features, you need to have some technical knowledge about networks, which can get very broad and detailed in most ordinary game development. But thankfully, MSW provides various features that help simplify the process. So once you understand the basic concepts of networks, you should be able to use MSW with relative ease. So these server, client, and sync are all related to networks. And again, in terms of networks, it's a very broad area. So I'll just give you a basic overview. So there are several communication models, and the basic architecture of MSW is a server-client model. As you can see here, multiple clients connect to a single server to communicate and maintain connection. The server-client model is very well known, and there are a lot of resources out there on the internet, so I recommend you to look it up if you want to learn more about this. Basically, in this model, each of the clients is run by each user here, and the server is connected to each client. They send and receive messages via this connection. And the server also sends out messages when something changes, whether to a certain client or to all clients, sharing a variable or running a method, etc. So moving on, before we talk about what you can do in MSW, let's talk a bit more about components. I'm going to create a component here and name it student. Double click. Okay, so what do we have here in our student component? You see, we got a property, function, and an entity event handler, right? So let's first talk about property. I'm going to add a property named score. So the student component now has a property named score. And let's see what happens to the model we make. I am going to add a NPC here. It's an object. This one. And I'm going to add a student component to this entity. Add component, student here. Now you'll see that our student component is added right here. But then what is actually happening in the back end when we do this? So let me illustrate. Right here, I'll draw some picture. Let's say we have a server here. I'm going to draw it again, sorry. Server is usually a cloud-shaped object. I'm going to draw a client with another color, client. So when you create an entity, it exists in the server, and when you play the game, when you start the game, this entity is also created in our client. So basically, when you create an entity on the server, you're actually doing two things. Creating it once on the server, and again on the client. And once you add an entity, it gains an internal ID, which is used to identify each entity. So you can think of them, these two, being connected. But strictly speaking, the entities are not actually connected to each other, but you can just think of them as being connected for better understanding. So in other words, if you manipulate the entity here, the same things needs to happen here. So that's what synchronization is. So moving on, let's take a look at syncing in the context of our property. Here, we have a property called score, and let's say I give the score the value of 1 by making a new function. Here, I'm going to change the score to 1. So what do you think is supposed to happen next? So remember that there were two entities, one in the server, one in the client. Here, entity, an entity here. These two entities exist in different spaces, and they have a property called score. Okay, so first, the value starts out as 0, and you can change this value to 1 in either of two spaces. So if you change the value of score first on the server to 1, then the score becomes 1 on the server, but it stays 0 on the client. And of course, if you change the score on the client instead, the reverse happens. The score becomes 1 on the client, but still 0 on the server. That's because the score is a property of a component in an entity here. And these two entities exist in different spaces from each other. So changing one does not change the other. That's why you can have 1 for the score on one side and 0 on the other. Practically, they still refer to the same objects in the context, but they end up with different values on the server and the client. But this can cause problems and create issues. Therefore, in a client-server model, there's an additional step that changes the other value to match first. When something changes in the entity here, it tells the other that it has changed. It tells the other that it has changed. Then the entity here goes, okay, I'll change it to, and change it to 1. So this is what you called sorry, there's a typo. You called synchronization. So two different things matching each other. So in a classical methodology, you need to put some effort to update each other side whenever you make changes on one side, in the client or the server. But this is really tedious and open to human error, which can cause much more problems. It's also difficult and it's a technical task. So what we tried to do with MSW was to simplify this. So as you can see here, okay, I'm going to erase this. You have the option to automatically synchronize the property. See? This green sync right here. This means that this property will be automatically synchronized if you click on here and off. If it's off, it won't be synchronized. So sync is always on by default. And when it's on, so remember, when we change the value from the server or either the client here, server and client, score. When you change 1 here, this will also change to 1 automatically. And this also works vice versa. So when you change the client first, server will always change automatically without you having to do anything. MSW is doing the work required to update the client score, and it still needs to send out the messages and packets and all that, but you don't have to worry about it. Just know that if you change something on the server, MSW changes the same thing on the client. So this is the summary of synchronization. And one more thing is that for other types, such as any and table, let me see. Yeah, for any and table, you cannot use sync. It won't change even when you click on this. Also, maybe dictionaries. Yeah. Oh, dictionary, it works. Yeah, so for any and table, doesn't work. But for other types, synchronization is supported. So try clicking on each data types to see what works and what doesn't. But as you can see, MSW does synchronizes most type of elements except for a few types. So in sum, you can automatically synchronize the changes for score in our student component. I hope you understood the concepts of synchronization and client-server model. And now, we will need to talk about the direction of synchronization.